from there. Okay, so today we're looking at Ivan Ilych, The Death of Ivan Ilych, which is a famous novella by an author that you might have heard of, Leo Tolstoy, famous Russian novelist, most famous for I guess we could say War and Peace, or we could say Anna Karenina, various other works. Those are his masterpiece novels, extraordinarily long, very heavy reading. And if you do read them, it's hard to keep track of what's going on because the cast of characters is so long. It really is like an enormous painting with all sorts of characters. And the fact that it's written in Russian means that the characters also have three names often. And they, in addition to the three names that the characters have, they often have nicknames or derivative names that are used in certain contexts, which makes it very challenging for the reader who's not Russian to know who the author is actually talking about even. So here we have an example. I thought I saw something with three names. No, I don't. Not in front of me. Oh, yeah. Ivan Yegorovich Shebek's office. Sometimes it'll be Ivan. Other times there'll be an abbreviation of that or some sort of, and that depends on the context. So if you're annoyed with someone, so I have a friend named Lena. Her name's Helena, Elena in Russian. Short Lena. If you're angry, apparently you can say Lenorka. So again, so all context, in the same way in English we'll use diminutives, usually a Y at the end, so you shorten it. James becomes Jim, which becomes Jimmy, but there's no angry form of that. Same in Russian, and then the three names as well, so it becomes very difficult to keep track of it. So written in English, written in Russian, translated into English, we're going to struggle a little bit with that. But I think what you will find with this particular novella is that we have an extraordinary, small, quasi-Christian engagement. And in terms of chronology, Tolstoy is living between, what have I got here? I'm always bad at the facts like this, 1828 to 1910. So during the same Victorian period that we just looked at, so while in Britain with Tennyson, Victoria is the great figure of the day, in Russia we are living still under the time of the Tsars. It's not, when I say Tsar, that's Tsars, T-S-A-Z-R, T-S-A-R-S. So the kings, the monarchs, it's very much medieval. Russia is a very backward country in a sense. It's not experienced the Enlightenment in the same way. Napoleon marched all the way to Moscow, trying to bring the revolution there. Didn't entirely succeed, but did leave behind significant transformations of Russian culture, very much Frenchified. So in War and Peace, the aristocrats speak French to one another to show how progressive and modern they are. Tolstoy, when he writes The Death of Ivan Ilych, is 50 years old, and he's had a midlife crisis, if 50 counts as midlife, and it's left him espousing some form of Christianity. And this is the first work that expresses that he writes. He takes 2 years to write this little short story that you're going to read. It's not that short, but it's a novella, 12 chapters in all. And I do think it's a little masterpiece. And there is a sort of symbolic completeness to the number 12, biblically speaking, but even in terms of Western literature, if you think about the Aeneid being a 12-book work, or Milton's Paradise Lost being 12 books. I don't think this is by any means an epic, but it is nonetheless a heavily redacted and very carefully written work. Very small and in some ways perfect. The subject matter is extraordinary. It begins with the death of the author. The main figure, Ivan Ilych, by the time the novella is written, is actually dead. That's the opening scene. And so it does undertake something of an epic trajectory insofar as it begins in the middle of things with the death of the author, and then it backtracks. And that alone is interesting and extraordinary. It's a bit, in this sense, like a detective novel. You often, or even when it's filmed or put onto TV, they begin with a murder scene, and then they backtrack to the point where you got to that action, and then the action goes forward. But that's the case in a detective. That's not the case here. It doesn't move beyond the death of the author here. The author's death is the centerpiece of the whole narrative. And in that, it is very Christian. Because if you think about the gospel narratives, many people would say that these are accounts of Jesus' life. So it has a biographical quality about them, and that's true. But they're funny biographies, if you are writing a biography, because I would say the majority of Jesus' life is simply unknown. It's not recorded, and it's of no interest to the writers of the gospel accounts. We know nothing about what happens to Jesus between the ages of about 2 and 30, with one exception. When he's 12, he reads from the scroll at his bar mitzvah in the temple. It's showing that he's a man. And in that, he reads from it and announces that it's about him, furthermore. So he has a sense at the age of 12 that the scriptures are directly not only about Christian themes, but about him, and announces that. That's at the age of 12, but then he disappears for 18 years. We know nothing about that period. What we do find in the gospel accounts, 2/3 of the written gospels deal with the last week of Jesus' life and the aftermath. So for a biography, it's an extraordinary thing that the main focus is on the death. I can't think of any biography that's written that way. If I read some biographies, some people love biographies, it always comes at the end, or almost always, and the main subject of interest is the life that they lived, not the death they had at the end. The death is told, and then there's a memorial and their eulogies, people talking about how important this figure was, but the biography is interested in the figure, the life of the figure, not the death. But the death is the focus of the Gospels, and the significance of the death. And the cross of Christ is the universal symbol of Christianity. It's not the cradle. It's not even the Bible. It's the cross. So it's a symbol of death. And Tolstoy, when he comes to write the Death of Ivan Ilych, has that sense of the importance of death in Christian thinking. And so he's doing something here in this little novella that I think is rather fascinating. We saw it a little bit last semester, if you were with me. Some of you were, but not all. We looked at a little morality play called Everyman, where death comes in, strides in, and speaks to this character called Everyman and says, "Your time's up, you're coming with me." God sends death to do this. He's a messenger. And then the play unfolds. So it is related to that. And it's not that it's never a theme in literature, but here it's a strong, dominant theme. So that in itself is very interesting. So it begins with the death of the main protagonist at the age of 45, and only then moves back to the beginning of Ivan's life. So chapter 1, so it's 12 chapters. Chapter 1 deals with the death, and we'll look at chapter 1 today. Next time we'll move on beyond that look to the structure of it. But then in chapter 2, just giving you a sense of the structure of it, it goes back to his early beginnings and tells us the first 40 years of his life, basically. And that goes on for an extended period, and we get a lengthy discussion of Ivan's life. And the chapters are pretty long, I mean, relatively speaking, for a short novella. And we find about how he came to be the man that he is and everything about him. And then we're told about an event that happens. And by the way, it's written very matter-of-factly. So in terms of narrative perspective, it's realism that we're getting here. There's no sense of the supernatural. It is talking about death. It is, as I say, written by somebody who professes some form of Christian faith. I think we could question how Christian he is, but still, some sense of that. But he doesn't get into theology per se. He doesn't get into even metaphysical speculations about death and what it means for life. But it's the center of this, and it forces us, even though it's written in a realistic form, it pushes us to get below the surface of the narrative. Like it's carefully crafted so that it prompts the reader to want to dig deeper. And in this sense, I think it's very much like biblical narrative. Biblical narrative is very much the same, very much realism, and yet a sense that there's something more going on in the story than simply this happened, and then this happened, and then this figure strode in, and so forth. There's a sense of the supernatural there, lurking. God never comes into the picture here, by the way. You might have noticed that if you've read it. There's no reference to God. But there are visions. He has a vision of a black bag, a black sack, and he's pushed down into it and so forth. But it's very simple, very matter-of-fact prose, told by a narrator who we trust. There's no reason to distrust the narrator. I say that because we're going to come in Heart of Darkness in a week's time to a narrator who is unreliable. We have good reason to suspect that his tale is not without motivation. He might not be entirely candid in his own view of what's going on around him, which is quite unsettling. But here we have nothing of the sort. It's told in the same way that the Gospels are told, from a narrative perspective that the reader has every reason to believe is factual. And to some degree is an omniscient narrator. He seems to know everything. Nothing's left from his view. And he tells us, including he tells us what the characters are thinking. Not just what they say, but what they're thinking. Which moves away from the biblical narrative, by the way. We don't, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, when you read scripture, we never get inside the characters' heads. The modern novel tends to go on at great length, and even sometimes on pages, what a character's thinking there in a particular scene. In fact, in some novels, it is almost entirely inside the characters' heads. Nothing actually happens, but you hear people thinking, and there is some sort of external action, but really the main focus is within the characters' minds. It's very much of a product of Romanticism, I think, the modern novel. But in biblical narrative, it doesn't do this. It just talks about characters come in, and then they speak, and then they respond to each other. And their speech is all we have to go on to explain what the characters are thinking. That and a little bit of stage direction. So when Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac, can you imagine what's going through his head? I mean, Abraham, who's been called by God to leave the land of Ur, to go into this other country, told that he will have a son who will be the father of many nations, etc. And he doesn't have a son. And then he's 99 and he's told his wife's pregnant, and they laugh. Come on. Then they have the son, and then God says to him, I want you to go sacrifice your son, your only son. What must he be thinking? We're all wondering. You can imagine. We're not told. It's not there in the story. Extraordinary. And the Bible does that to pull us in to that situation, to almost to imagine it. It pulls it. It evokes our imagination that way. It doesn't fill our imagination with the thoughts of the characters. Same thing happens in the gospel narratives, by the way. We're not really told what characters are thinking unless they say it. Then we're told reported speech. But here in Tolstoy, he moves more in the modern direction, and he will tell us what characters are thinking. By the way, Shakespeare does this a little bit with his soliloquies in his plays. So when a character walks to the front of the stage, like Hamlet, says to be or not to be, that's the question. That's the way Shakespeare does what modern movies do, which is to have a character sort of looking with his mouth closed, and then you hear his voice talking. It's just a way of presenting thought to us. But it's not dramatic, right? There's no action going on here. The Bible sticks to action. It's very active, it's very exciting, the narrative. Here we get it more and more in the novel and novella. We get more and more, less importance placed on action and words and more on the psychological or internal life of the characters. I happen to think it's a bad turn myself. I think it's inherently undramatic. It's why most people don't want to read novels and aren't interested in literature. So for those of you who've come to Tyndale and are stuck here in my English class thinking, I hate English, I've always hated English, I hate the stories, I have some sympathy, but you've already seen that much of what is written in literature is not like that, but modern stuff is. Very internal, very much the feelings of the author. That's what we're being told about, or his thoughts, but not his actions. There's no adventure. As I say, literature before the 19th century is full of adventure and an event and action and people speaking and then battles ensuing, etc. Conflict. So he tells it in that sort of matter-of-fact prose, which is very much like biblical narrative, but he internalizes, very much important on what, and the emphasis is on what the characters are thinking. So there's a view put out there in the 1940s called Ideas Have Consequences. And I happen to hold that is true. However, I don't think it's so true that actions don't have consequences. But the dominant thrust of our age is that it's the ideas that have the consequences and not the actions. The biblical view is that the actions have the consequences. So we become more and more passive, more and more reflective, if you will, but without any sense of what are the consequences of ideas, because we don't see any actions. And I think it leads to a great deal of confusion. Anyway, that's just my critique of it. Tolstoy is bringing in the thoughts of the characters, and these become very important in relation to the main subject, which is death. What are the characters thinking about death? And I think Tolstoy's purpose in this, and I'll get to this in a sec, is to, much as he was converted at the age of 50, to bring about a conversion in his readers. He wants them to stop living life the way Ivan Ilych did, denying that death is a reality that they're going to have to confront. And in that sense, it's pretty striking for us. When I say us living in 2023. Most people don't think about death or their own death. Most people haven't seen death with their own eyes. They haven't seen anybody die in front of them. And we tend to put death away. We stick it in places where experts handle death. Hospitals or hospices or whatever. We put people there in part because it's hard to take care of people at the end of their life. Often they're very needy, dependent. But I think part of it is just the revulsion of the experience of death and the desire to avoid it. And I think that's part of what prompted the whole COVID response. And the hysteria and overreaction of it was the fear that death might be coming and we might not be able to stop it, and we'll do anything to stop it. We don't even want to think about it. So any actions taken to prevent that thing that we don't want to think about would be taken, including the crazy things that were actually proposed, which is that you lock down healthy people to keep them from, the invisible enemy, and you wear masks and you social distance and who knows whatever. Or you wear 2 masks or 3, and you don't quarantine sick people, which has been the biblical practice from ever, and also is the standard of care under public health all the way up until 2019. You don't quarantine healthy people, but that's what we did. For me, part of the reason is this topic of death. It's the fear of death. And Tolstoy touches on it in a way that I think is very profound. So it is a sort of a mirror of modern life then. And I think, so Tolstoy means it as a mirror of his 19th century progressive Muscovite life, where, again, Moscow, I should say something about that. You know that Moscow is the center of Russia. It's the imperial city, or at least it's one of them. It's the seat of the Russian government at any rate. It's the largest city. It's also a city that you need a special passport to be in its environs. You can't stay there if you don't have permission. A bit like Beijing is my understanding in that sense. So it's not like Toronto where you can just drive in, drive out. You need to have a special permission to reside there. And it's very much because it's the seat of government and power, you want to, if you want wealth and influence and you want to climb the ladder of privilege and influence and wealth, you want to live in Moscow. So it's a desire to be with the in crowd where things are happening. And we'll find that Ivan spends his early years wanting to be there. He doesn't live there. He lives out in the countryside. And he wants to get in because he's not in, he's outside. He's an outsider. So he's trying to climb the ladder of career and ambition and build himself up a life like a ladder. He's trying to climb the ladder of ambition. And what he describes there, and I think this is why I say it's of modern life, is very much the life that we live here now. People want to get busy, get a good job, do well for themselves, climb the ladder, whatever it is. They call it a corporate ladder, but your career ladder, and busy yourself with achieving those goals without ever reflecting on the thing that Tolstoy wants to bring to our attention, which is that you're going to die. You may get to the top of that ladder, but you're still going to die. And Tolstoy thinks that the reality of death is something that cannot be ignored. And he's not going to let us ignore it. And he makes the emphasis like an exclamation point by having his main character dead on the first page. And what we will find, I'll get into it more specifically, clearly, but you can see it right there in the first paragraph. He's dead. Is that this character, Ivan, has lived a life without any meaning or purpose other than avoiding reality. He's tried to avoid the one fact about every human life that is true for all. We all share it in common. We are all going to die. Christians have a lot to say about death. Actually, all religions have a lot to say about death. Most people in our generation don't call themselves religious, more and more. And part of the reason for that, I think, is they don't want to think about it. They don't want to think about death or the meaning of life and so forth. They just want to live the life the way they want to live it. They want to do things that they enjoy, and they don't want to be bothered by divisive matters, because it is divisive, by the way. There's nothing more divisive than death. under COVID, we were so terrified of death, we were willing to be divided from our relatives in a hospital. We weren't even allowed to see them, and everyone agreed to it and said it was okay. A pastor couldn't go and visit somebody on their deathbed. How terrified must people be to be willing to sacrifice every human connection to avoid death on a national and international scale? And what does it say about the way in which people are trying to take charge of their own life and live it as on the terms that they have determined for themselves? So we're going to find this character Ivan Ilych. Let me read the first chapter or parts of it, and we'll make a comment on it. But as I say, it is a mirror of modern life. I'll say more about that in a second. But Ivan is a lawyer. I don't know if Tolstoy is making a comment about lawyers and their occupations and so forth, but he is a lawyer. In the big building of the law courts during a break-in hearing the case of the Malvinskys, the members and the prosecutor met in Ivan Yegorovich Shebek's office, and the conversation turned to the famous Krasovsky case. Fyodor Vasilyevich became heated, demonstrating non-jurisdiction. Ivan Yegorovich stood his ground, and as for Peter Ivanovich, not having entered into the argument in the beginning, he took no part in it and was looking through the just delivered Gazette. He's looking through a newspaper. In that day, newspapers were the way information was disseminated. "Gentlemen," he said, "Ivan Ilych is dead." "Can it be? Here, read it," he said to Fyodor Vasilyevich, handing him the paper, still smelling of fresh ink. Inside, a black border was printed, "Is with profound grief that Praskovia Fyodorovna Golovin informs relations and acquaintances of the passing away of her beloved husband, Ivan Ilyich Golovin, member of the Court of Law, which took place on the 4th of February of this year, 1882. The funeral will take place on Friday at 1 p.m. This is how you inform everybody that a funeral is taking place. It's not a public event. It was a private event. Now it's public. Everybody is informed about it. And then we get Tolstoy's explanation. I'm teaching Tolkien next. I must have that in my mind as well. Ivan Ilych had been a colleague of the assembled gentlemen, and they had all liked him. He had been ill for several weeks. It had been said that his illness was incurable. His post had been kept open for him, but there was an understanding that in the case of his death, Alexeyev might be named to his post, and to Alexeyev's post either Vinnikov or Stabel. So that on hearing of Ivan Ilych's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen assembled in the office was of what this death might mean in terms of transfers or promotions of the members themselves or of their acquaintances. Now again, the narrator is not only recording their conversation, because they're not having this conversation. It would be impolite to have the conversation, but he's putting us in the minds of the characters because he knows how they think and what they're thinking about. And what are they thinking about? They're thinking about the way in which a death will advantage them. But they're not thinking about the death. They're just thinking about climbing. They're thinking of the same sorts of things, actually, that Ivan spent all of his days thinking about. How to take the next step. And so you'll get a lot of thought, Fyodor Vasilyevich. So again, it's inherently undramatic if it's spun out over great lengths. So if we get a character's thoughts that go on for pages and pages, I think it loses the dramatic power. If we get it in little snippets like this, I think it actually is quite powerful and profound. And it can then address something that, in general, as I say, narrative, historically speaking, tends to ignore, which is the thinking processes of the characters. It just shows their actions. And that's not because for the biblical writers and for traditional authors, the thinking of the characters is of no significance. It's that all they're interested in is the outcome of the process of thought, which is when you act. And you will know what the character's thinking by what they then do and what they then say. And you can even show that sometimes they'll use speech in a duplicitous way. And you can still demonstrate that in the text. They'll say one thing and then they'll act divergently from that. Sometimes it's irony, sometimes it's hypocrisy, but that's still a way of displaying it. But this gets inside of it, and I think it works quite powerfully. Now I'll probably get Stabel's or Vinnikov's post, thought Fyodor Vasilievich. It was promised to me long ago, and the promotion means a raise of 800 rubles plus office expenses. I now must request my brother-in-law's transfer from Kaluga, thought Pyotr Ivanovich. My wife will be very glad. So now we can bring the whole family into Moscow, because I'll have a promotion, I'll be at a certain rank that will allow me to bring my family into the environs of Moscow. Now she won't be able to say, I've never done anything for her family. His wife's been complaining at him. Why? Because he doesn't care about his family, he just cares about his own ambitions. But now I can take care of my own ambitions and at the same time do something for my family. So we get selfish characters revealing their selfishness. I thought he would never get on his feet, Pyotr Ivanovich said aloud. What a pity. What did he think, and then what did he say? What he said was expressions of sympathy, as you would expect. That's not what he thought. But what exactly did he have? The doctors couldn't determine. That is, they did, but differently. So the experts were divided. When I saw him the last time, it seemed to me he'd recover. And I haven't visited him since the holidays. I kept meaning to. Did he have money? It seems his wife has a little something, but quite insignificant. Yes. We'll have to go. Everything's far from you. See, he can't forgive me for living across the river, Pyotr Ivanovich said, smiling at Shebek. And they started talking about the long distances in town and went back to the session. Apart from the reflections, this death called up in each of them about the transfers and possible changes at work that might result from it. The very fact of the death of a close acquaintance called up in all those who heard of it, as always, a feeling of joy that it was he who was dead and not I. You see, he's dead and I'm not. Each of them thought or felt. Close acquaintances, Ivan Ilych's so-called friends, involuntarily thought as well that it would now be necessary for them to fulfill the very boring obligations of decency and go to the funeral service and to the widow on a visit of condolence. So what you note here is that there are Christian niceties, there's an expectation of Christian conduct. A death has happened. What do? You go to the funeral. Show your respects. There's an awareness of consequence, and there's a way of dealing with it as well. Public expectations that go with it, but that means going to this service and going to visit the widow and express some sort of language that will express the feeling of loss. Closest of all were Fyodor Vasilievich and Pyotr Ivanovich. Pyotr Ivanovich had been Ivan Ilych's comrade in law school, old college friend, and considered himself as under obligation to him. Having told his wife over the over dinner the news of Ivan Ilych's death and his reflections on the possible transfer of his brother-in-law to their district, Peter Ivanovich, without lying down to rest, put on his tailcoat and drove to Ivan Ilych's. Why? Because he felt under obligation. He didn't want to go. He felt like he ought to go. But only after he's told his wife about how it will benefit her. Why is he telling her that? Because she's equally selfish. All she wants to do is to promote her family and help them. He pulls himself up, and she's willing to go along with it as long as she and her family are also brought along with it for the ride. And then having done that, he puts on his tailcoat, so a formal attire, and he goes to visit the widow. At the entrance to Ivan Ilych's apartment stood a carriage and 2 cabs. Downstairs in the front hall by the coat rack, leaning against the wall, was a silk brocaded coffin, lid with tassels and freshly polished gold braid. 2 ladies in black were taking off their fur coats. One, Ivan Ilych's sister, he knew. The other was an unknown lady. Peter Ivanovich's colleague, Schwarz, was about to come downstairs. Schwarz means black in German, by the way. Was about to come downstairs, and from the topmost step, seeing him enter, stopped and winked at him as if to say, Ivan Ilyich made a botch of it. We'll do better, you and I. So it's a sort of a conspiratorial, yeah, he's died, but we're not going to. Now, he doesn't actually think that, in the sense we'll just carry on as if this were never going to affect us. Schwarz's face was its English side whiskers, and his whole slim figure and its tailcoat had, as usual, an elegant solemnity, and this solemnity, always in contrast to Schwarz's playful character, had a special piquancy here. So thought Peter Ivanovich. Peter Ivanovich let the ladies go ahead of him and slowly followed them up the stairs. Schwarz did not start down, but remained upstairs. Peter Ivanovich understood why. He obviously wanted to arrange there to play vint that evening. Vint's a form of cards. We're here to do this, to pay our respects, our condolences, but actually we're not going to do that. We're here, and now that we're away from home, we can indulge ourselves and do what we like. We play a little bit of cards here. The ladies went on upstairs to the widow, and Schwarz, with seriously compressed, firm lips and a playful glance, moved his eyebrows to show Peter Ivanovich to the right, with a little nod of the head, to the dead man's room. Peter Ivanovich went in, as always happens, with some perplexity about what he was to do there. One thing he did know, that crossing oneself on such occasions never did any harm. I don't know if you've seen, the Orthodox tend to cross themselves. They do it the opposite way the Catholics do, but it doesn't matter. They cross themselves. So concerning the need to bow at the same time, he was not quite sure, and therefore he chose something in between. Going into the room, he began to cross himself and to bow slightly, as it were. And at the same time, insofar as his moving hand and head allowed him, he looked around the room. Now, it's very deftly done by Tolstoy and comic. 2 young men, one a schoolboy, nephews apparently, were crossing themselves as they left the room. A little old lady stood motionless, and a lady with strangely raised eyebrows was saying something to her in a whisper. A reader in a frock coat, brisk, resolute, was loudly reading something with an expression that precluded all contradiction. The butler's helper, Gerasim, passing in front of Peter Ivanovich with light steps, sprinkled something on the floor. Seeing this, Peter Ivanovich at once sensed a slight smell of decaying corpse. During his last visit with Ivan Ilyich, Peter Ivanovich had seen this muzhik in the study. He had performed the duties of a nurse. Reference to him. So he's a sort of a servant. This figure Gerasim. We'll find he's an important character. but he'd performed the duties of a nurse, and Ivan Ilych had especially liked him. Peter Ivanovich kept crossing himself and bowing slightly in an intermediary direction between the coffin, the reader, and the icons on a table in the corner. Then, when this movement of crossing himself with his hands seemed to have gone on too long, he stopped and began to examine the dead man. So it's faintly ridiculous. He's going around through the room sort of hunched over, doing a lot of crossing, looking around at the same time. All of it, he's posing, he's acting. And we're going to find that everybody there is acting. They're playing a role that they're expected to play without actually meditating on the significance of the event. In fact, the acting is what prevents them from thinking about it. Even the Christian acting. Here's the rite we go through at this point. And people find that when they go into churches now, they're not used to going to church. They sit around there and what am I supposed to do here? I'm not even sure. So if you're new to a church, you've never gone into a church, one of the first things you do, I'll tell you as an adult convert, is you come in and you sit at the back. And you don't want anyone to notice you. You just like to sneak in. You probably don't even want to go in early, because if you go in early, somebody might greet you, and you don't want that. So you come in a little bit late, intentionally late, and then you come in and you sit in the back row. And you try and avoid people's glances so that nobody will greet you. It's going to watch what's going on here. This man is in a different situation because he's had a Christian culture and a Christian context, and he knows everybody in Russia is a Christian, except that they're not. But culturally they are. And he knows that how he's supposed to behave. Well, it never hurts to cross yourself, so I'll do that. But really, the crossing is just a sort of a facade. It's an action that he undertakes, but it doesn't reflect what's going on inside him. And that's Tolstoy's point here. Very much a preoccupation with what's on the surface and not what's within a person. So Tolstoy is showing us the hypocrisy of a Christian culture that doesn't actually believe what the actions would suggest. It does. So he looks at the dead man. The dead man lay, as dead men always lie, with a peculiar heaviness, dead man fashion. His stiffened limbs sunk into the lining of the coffin, his forever bent head on the pillow, displaying, as dead men always do, his yellow, waxen forehead with the hair brushed forward on his sunken temples, and his thrust-out nose as if pressing down on his upper lip. He had changed very much, had grown still thinner since Peter Ivanovich last saw him. But as with all dead people, his face was more handsome, and above all more significant than it had been in the living man. There was on his face the expression that what needed to be done had been done, and done rightly. Besides that, there was also in that expression a reproach or a reminder to the living. This reminder seemed out of place to Peter Ivanovich, or at least of no concern to him. Something felt unpleasant to him, and therefore Peter Ivanovich crossed himself again hastily, too hastily, as it seemed to him to conform to decency, turned and went to the door. Schwartz was waiting for him in the passage, his legs straddled, his hands playing with his top hat behind his back. One glance at Schwartz's playful, clean, and elegant figure refreshed Peter Ivanovich. Let me just say something before I carry on the reading. Note that the dead man signifies something. He's a sign. And I just want to talk a little bit about how language works here, because in our day, people talk about language as if it's something that we possess. It's a tool, and it's a tool that we can use to fulfill any function that we want of it. And it's a certain view of language that's very much of a 20th century view of language, which is that there's no connection between signs and things. That there's no underlying reality. We can use language to point to any old thing that we want to. It's just a tool that can be used for any purpose. But there's no necessary connection between a word and what it signifies. But here in the Death of Ivan Ilych, there's a strong sense that it's not just the word, but the very fact of his death that signifies something, and it signifies something profound. And he just hints at it here. His face is more significant. How is it more significant? It's signifying his death. It signified that, and the living man did not. The living man didn't think about his death. So even the face of the dead man has now a signification that it didn't before. And interestingly, the description is that it's more handsome. Now, I don't know if you've seen a dead person, but they don't look more handsome when they're dead. But there's something here in the narrative, the narrator Tolstoy's perspective, that shows that there's also a beauty in death. It's not something only to be feared. There's something there. But note that this character of Peter Ivanovich doesn't want anything to do with it. And part of it's a reproach to the living. Well, what's the reproach? It's the reproach that you are ignoring me. And now you can't ignore me because I'm looking you in the face. And I'm not looking you. You're looking me in the face, and my face is dead. They don't have open coffins anymore. It's become a cultural practice that we've largely stopped. I don't know if you've been to funerals, but most funerals, the coffins are closed. If you have a coffin, often you cremate. Take the body and make it into ashes in a bowl, and hand the ashes and think, what am I supposed to do with this? Anyway. And then people do various things with it. They scatter them somewhere, they bury them, I don't know. They maybe stick them on the mantelpiece of a fireplace or something. But it actually signifies something. A dead body signifies something. These days we don't even have funerals. A sense of loss, you have a celebration of life. That's just another way of avoiding the reality of death. It's suggesting that we can, in our minds, remember a person as if they were living even though they're dead, and deny that death has even happened. I think it's the same thing that we see here. It's carrying on with a pageant of let's occupy ourselves with busy things and appear happy even though we're enormously sad. We've lost mom or dad or a brother or sister or who knows, son or a daughter. We're going to celebrate the life at the moment of a death. Extraordinary thing. And that's exactly what he does here. One glance at him, Peter understood that he, Schwartz, was above it all and would not succumb to depressing impressions. His look alone said, the incident of the funeral service for Ivan Ilych could in no way serve as a sufficient motive for considering the order of the session disrupted. What's the session? The session of cards. Don't think that the important business of the card game we're going to have is going to be interrupted by a death of our dear friend. He even said so in a whisper to the passing Peter Ivanovich, suggesting that they get together for a game at Fyodor Vasilyevich's. But Peter Ivanovich was evidently not fated to play vint that evening. Why? The widow is there. Praskovya Fyodorovna, a short, fat woman, who despite all her efforts to achieve the contrary, still broadened from the shoulders down, dressed all in black, her head covered with lace, and with the same strangely raised eyebrows as the lady who had stood facing the coffin, came out of her rooms with other ladies and, accompanying them to the dead man's door, said, "The service will begin at once. Please go in." And he's in the room, and the service is going to be too late. He can't get out. Now he's going to have to be there for the funeral service. That's what he showed up for, of course. But he was about to get out before it happened. Too late now. Schwartz, bowing indefinitely, stood there, apparently neither accepting nor declining this suggestion. Praskovya Fyodorovna, recognizing Peter Ivanovich, sighed, went up close to him, took him by the hand, and said, "I know you were a true friend of Ivan Ilych," and looked at him. expecting some action from him that would correspond to those words. Peter Ivanovich knew that as there he had to cross himself, so here he'd had to press her hand, sigh, and say, "Believe me." So again, there's prompting that doesn't come from within the character's desires, but from the social expectations. I know there I had to cross myself. Now I have to say, hold their hand and say, "Believe me." That's what I do now. So I play the part. And so he did. And having done that, he felt the result achieved was the desired one, that he was moved and she was moved. Are they actually moved? No. But they're playing that they're moved. "Come while it hasn't started. I must talk with you," said the widow. "Give me your arm." Peter Ivanovich offered her his arm, and they went to the inner rooms, past Schwartz, who winked mournfully at Peter Ivanovich. "There goes our vent. Don't complain if we take another partner, unless you join us as a fifth when you get free," said his playful glance. He said on the sorry, it's all through the eyes. Why would he be able to do this with his eyes? Because they all think exactly the same way, which is, we know that we're going to prioritize having fun and ignore any interruptions to that. We're just going to be entertained. Neil Postman wrote a book a few decades ago called "Amusing Ourselves to Death." There you go. It's exactly what it is. Peter Ivanovich sighed still more deeply and mournfully, and Praskovya Fyodorovna gratefully pressed his arm. Having gone into her drawing room, upholstered in pink cretonne with a sullen lamp, they sat by the sofa, she on the sofa, Peter Ivanovich on a low pouf with bad springs, so like a footstool, that gave way erratically under his weight. Praskovya Fyodorovna wanted to warn him that he should sit on another chair, but she found such a warning inconsistent with her position and changed her mind. She's seated up above him. She sort of likes that. So maybe I won't do that after all. Throughout, subtly, Tolstoy indicates the selfishness and superficiality of all the characters. They're all motivated by the least admirable qualities that you can imagine in an event of enormous moral significance, personal significance, including the wife, the widow. As he sat down in this pouf, Peter Ivanovich recalled how Ivan Ilych had decorated this drawing room and had consulted him about this same cretonne, pink with green leaves, passing by the table and sitting down on the sofa. Generally, the whole drawing room was filled with knickknacks and furniture. The widow caught the black lace of her black mantilla on the carving of the table. It catches as she goes by, and it's holding on to her. Peter Ivanovich got up to release it, and the pouf, freed from him, roused itself and gave him a shove. So it's a big spring on it, and he pops up. The widow began to release the lace herself, and Peter Ivanovich sat down again, crushing the rebellious pouf under him. But the widow did not release it completely, and Peter Ivanovich got up again. Again, comic scene. And again, the pouf rebelled and even gave a snap. When all this was over, she took out a clean cambric handkerchief and began to cry. The episode with the lace and the struggle with the pouf cooled Peter Ivanovich down, and he sat scowling. This awkward situation was interrupted by Sokolov, Ivan Ilych's butler, in the report that the plot in the cemetery chosen by Praskovya Fyodorovna would cost 200 rubles. She stopped crying and, glancing at Peter Ivanovich with the air of a victim, said in French that it was very hard for her. Peter Ivanovich had made a silent gesture, expressing the unquestionable conviction that it could not be otherwise. "Smoke, please," she said in a magnanimous and at the same time broken-hearted voice, and she began to discuss the question of the price of the plot with Sokolov. Peter Ivanovich, lighting up the cigarette, heard her asking in great detail about the prices of various plots and determining which should be taken. Besides that, having finished about the plot, she also gave orders about the choir. Sokolov left. "I do everything myself," she said to Peter Ivanovich, pushing aside the albums that lay on the table, and noticing that the table was threatened with ashes, she promptly moved an ashtray for Peter Ivanovich. Peter's just letting the ashes fall on the table. And said, "I find it false to claim that grief prevents me from concerning myself with practical matters. On the contrary, if anything can, not comfort, but distract me, it is my troubles over him." She took out her handkerchief again, and as if she was about to cry, but suddenly, as if overcoming herself, gave a shake and began to speak calmly. "However, I have business with you." Peter Ivanovich bowed, not allowing the springs of the poof, which at once began stirring under him, to act up. During the last days, he suffered terribly. "He suffered very much?" asked Peter Ivanovich. Terribly. The last, not minutes, but hours. He didn't stop screaming. For 3 days in a row, he screamed incessantly. It was unbearable. I can't understand how I endured it. It could be heard through 3 doors. What I've endured. She's not commiserating poor Ivan, who's crying for 3 days aloud without an unbroken, wailing, agonizing pain. There's no sympathy for him. She's asking him to commiserate with her, who had to hear him for 3 days, and did her best not to hear him by putting 3 doors between them. Closed 3 doors. She's not with her husband while he's in his agony. She's in another room, remote from him. "And can it be that he was conscious?" said Peter Ivanovich. "Yes," she whispered, "till the last moment. He said farewell to us a quarter of an hour before he died, and also asked that Volodya be taken away." The thought of the suffering of a man he had known so closely, first as a merry boy, a schoolmate, then as an adult colleague, despite the unpleasant awareness of his own and this woman's falsity, suddenly terrified Peter Ivanovich. He again saw that forehead, the nose pressing on the upper lip, and he felt afraid for himself. So for the first time, he hasn't been able to move away from him. 3 days of terrible suffering and then death. Why, that could come for me, too. Right now, any minute, he thought, and he was momentarily afraid. But at once, he did not know how, himself, the usual thought came to his aid, that this had happened to Ivan Ilych and not to him, and that it should and could not happen to him. That in thinking so, he had succumbed to a gloomy mood, which ought not to be done, as was obvious from Schwartz's face. And having reasoned thus, Peter Ivanovich calmed down and began asking with interest about the details of Ivan Ilych's death, and as if death was a proper occurrence only to Ivan Ilych, but not at all to him. Okay. So note here, he is, and today we've made this into an industry. We have people who are psychologists that think happy thoughts at all times, and there is a way of directing your thoughts and moods in this particular situation so that you don't actually confront a significant, meaningful event in your life. In other words, a death. And he is similarly minded. He says, I mustn't have a depressive thought. That wouldn't be right. And so he snaps himself out of it and he goes back to being as superficial in his treatment of the event as he had been before. But momentarily, it's broken through the calm veneer of his face. It's so hard, says Praskovia, Fyodorovna. It's so hard, so terribly hard. And he sighed and waited till she blew her nose. When she finished blowing her nose, because again, I guess that's what you do at this point, is you blow your nose, he said, "Believe me." And again she fell to talking and told him what was evidently her main business with him. This business consisted in the question of how to obtain money from the treasury on the occasion of her husband's death. She made it seem that she was asking for Pyotr Ivanovich's advice about a pension, but he saw that she already knew in the minutest detail things that he did not know, such as all that could be squeezed out of the treasury on the occasion of this death, but that she would like to find out whether it was not possible somehow to squeeze out more. So, the widow already knows how it's going to advantage her in minute details. She just wants to know if there's any other way she can benefit. She can squeeze the orange just a little bit more to get a little more juice out of the death and advantage her. Pyotr Ivanovich tried to think up some way, but having thought a little and for decency's sake, having scolded our government for its stinginess, he said it seemed that more was impossible. Then she sighed and obviously began thinking up some way to get rid of her visitor. Didn't want to talk to him anyway, the whole point of the whole thing. Okay, so what we get here in this portrait in chapter 1, which is going to be reinforced in the chapters that follow of the narrative of Ivan Ilych's own life and so forth, is a clear depiction done very artfully through the narrative of looking at the character's thoughts and actions and the motivations and the subtleties of how they act and move and so forth, is a demonstration of a totally superficial society, preoccupied with the trivial things of life. Totally preoccupied with material things. And further, and this will become reinforced when we look at Ivan, a worship of success and prosperity. The god of this novella is Mammon. It's going to be announced that it's money. It's a way of keeping yourself from death. You can comfort yourself with all of the pomp and comfort that will prevent any discomfort, any sense of pain and suffering. And we also have seen the social climbing that is throughout the whole novella, and the careerism and the self-centeredness, an utterly selfish group of people. Even the married couples, the marriage there is a marriage of convenience for the selfish interests of each and every party. And what we have not seen yet, but we will see, is that the families break down over this. And yet they aren't willing to change. There's a total conformity of the society to continue on and carry on as if everything weren't imploding all around them as a consequence of not living meaningful lives and not valuing community with other people and with God. Remember the references to religious observance are purely superficial. There's no substance to them whatsoever. They don't signify anything. Like they're signs, you make a sign, but it doesn't signify anything. It doesn't point to a reality that they actually believe, because if it did, they're crossing themselves, and the crossing would suggest that in the death of Ivan Ilych, there's another death that is infinitely meaningful at this point, and they should be brought into the consideration, but they don't. They just do the signage. And it doesn't signify, it doesn't point to anything. It doesn't point to anything substantial. And furthermore, and we're going to find this is certainly enhanced in the chapters that follow, there's a strong sense of belief in medicine and doctors ability to help us avoid death, cheat death. heal us from the thing that they're trying to ignore. And you will hear a sense of betrayal in Ivan's voice and in others when the doctors can't do what they want them to do. Note the narrative voice, because the narrative voice is, I talked about signs and the way words are. The narrator is pushing the reader. This is what's really interesting. It's subtle, but he's pushing the reader to, I want you not to respond the same way. I want you to think about these things. I want you to go beneath the surface, because I know that you are living in the same way that Ivan Ilych and all of his theater of friends is living. And you need to think a little bit more, not act the same way, not just go through the motions. Think about the meaning of death. Think about the meaning of the crossing of the death. What does that signify? As I say, death is announced as the main subject of the novella. And it structures the whole thing. So it's the portal to enter into the whole story, but then it structures what happens afterwards. And in terms of the structuring, by the way, there's the next, I believe it's 4 chapters that talk about the first 40 years of Ivan's life. And then it will go on to the last 4 weeks of his life, which will occupy another significant chunk. And what we will find is the chapters get ever more brief as it goes on. Now think about this, and you may not know this because most of you are very young. As you get older, the years don't change in their distance. It's 365 days and a bit. Every year is still a year. But as you get older, the years seem to go by more quickly. It's a funny old thing. And you remember as you get older things that happen to you when you're young, but not when you're old. I mean, when I say you don't remember things of the everyday occurrences, they just sort of wash over you. They don't seem significant. You are going and you're busy and you're tired, but you don't have the same sense of days lasting a long time. When you're young, you could say it's just in terms of percentage of your life. Like a year when you're 4 is a quarter of your life. A year for somebody who's 10 times that, well, it's 1/40th. And so just on the scale of proportionality, it's not as significant, right? So if you're marked by tragedy when you're young, it has a strong effect on you, disproportionately strong, and it strikes you, for that matter. And it's the instances of suffering and pain that really move you. Now, you poor folks have had to live through COVID-19 and the stupid, terrible lockdowns. And that will you'll never forget it. Nobody will ever forget it, but particularly the young will never forget it. It will have a disproportionate effect on the way you look at the future. It will. It's not just because it's unprecedented action, it's because it happens at a certain stage in your life, and that it really will affect you. The way in which the novella is being presented will show us the perspective of age and pain. And the reason I say that is, just like in the narrative of the Gospels, where I said that 2/3 of the majority of the written Gospels deals with the last week of Jesus' life and the events that follow. In the same way, the chapters here, even though they get shorter and shorter, still occupy most of the novella. And he doesn't go anywhere. Oh, by the way, so in the first 40 years of his life, he's young, he's active, he's moving around, he's trying to get up the career ladder, he's going here, doing that, he gets married, he has children, all of those things, very much mobile. Travels. In the last 4 weeks of his life, he does not leave his room. He's stuck on a bed, on a couch actually. He's in pain. He can't move. And all he can think about is his pain. If you've had a toothache, what do you think about outside of your toothache? Not a thing. Because all you can think about is the pain. Because it preoccupies you. You take something to get rid of the pain. Most people are, when they think of death, they're afraid of the pain as much as the death. And they're willing to euthanize themselves and let the government do it for that reason, to avoid that. It is partly to avoid the pain, but it's probably to avoid the idea of death, is to express some sort of control over something that we feel we have no control over, because death takes us, we don't take it. But as he gets older, as I say, or when he becomes injured, and by the way, he becomes injured, how does he become injured? He falls off a ladder. It's very telling. Been climbing the ladder, he falls off a ladder, he hurts his side. And it's seemingly a superficial injury, but guess what? It wasn't as superficial as all that. Very surprising. But he's stuck in pain, and that last 4 weeks, people are going to be willing to live their lives to totally deny those 4 weeks and spend their whole life ignoring that situation's coming. But it's compressed. But as it is, the chapters are relatively brief because they're uneventful. Can you imagine, and you won't have to imagine it yet, one day you're going to be in a room somewhere, probably, and you're probably not going anywhere. And that may be a year or two of your life. You already have experienced it because it's called COVID. You had to do that, right? But you do it when you're young. That's not something you should experience when you're young if you're healthy. But you're forced to do that. There's a lot of old people now that are in that situation, and the days are just as long, and yet are they that long? I don't think that they are. It's not my sense. Having said that, if you're in pain in the room for years, the pain itself probably seems long. And in both cases, the pain is pressing towards the reality that we're all moving towards, whether we acknowledge it or not, and that's the death that's coming. So what is the meaning of the death? That's what the novella is about. What's the meaning of the death? And when he's on his sick bed and when he's in pain, nonetheless he's going to have dreams, visions about being pushed down into a black sack towards death. And he's going to do his best to resist that. He doesn't even want to think about it. But in the end, he will actually see the light. Literally. He's going to see light. He's going to get pushed through, and he will embrace it. He will accept it. And Tolstoy, again, who's a convert at the age of 50, is going to be narrating for his audience the significance of facing death and taking it and accepting it well, not as a celebration of life, but as a reality that is meaningful. And as a Christian, it's so meaningful that the Lord himself not only endured a death, but endured a death for us and suffered alone, naked on a cross, abandoned by his friends, scorned by his enemies, crucified, cut off from the Father, cut off from everyone. That death was one that he overcame. He rose from the grave. So that's the centerpiece of the novel. It's the sign that Tolstoy is pointing us towards. And next time we'll talk about it in the subsequent chapters, which I think you'll find fit very much with this. And you'll see how artfully it's done to point us to think, and do it while you're young. Think about the meaning of life and the meaning of death and the fact that you are going to go there one day, and who knows when. And are you ready for that moment? Because Jesus overcame the grave. He rose from the grave. The light of the world. I'll leave you with that, and we'll pick it up next time.